Hello and welcome to Into the Fold, a Books and Lit Fest podcast with Jael and Lin. I'm one of your hosts. My name is Jael Richardson. I'm the founder and executive director at the Festival of Literary Diversity, or FOLD.
And I'm your other host. I'm Hudson Lin. I'm the program coordinator at the FOLD. Welcome to episode 2.
Episode 2!
Yeah,
we made it. We made
it.
This episode is sponsored by Sheridan's Honors Bachelor of Creative Writing and Publishing program, a 4-year degree that prepares students for a career in both writing and publishing. Visit sheridancollege.ca for more information. All right. So it's our second episode.
Mm-hmm.
We talked last time about the podcast in general and about the theme for this year leading up to the Festival of Literary Diversity, leading up to FOLD, being a decade of change. And I thought for this episode, we thought that we would talk a little bit about sort of the literary festival scene, the kind of process. And I thought maybe to start, we would talk a little bit about our own experience as authors.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm curious for you, Lynn, like what has the literary festival environment been for you as an author?
Yeah, so I've been to a couple of literary festivals as an author. One was the FOLD. We talked a little bit about last episode. And the FOLD was a little different because that was the first virtual year. Yeah. So it was like, we're all just like stuck in our homes. And but it was a really nice experience because it was the first time that I was like doing anything like this and trying to just see, well, what is it like to be an author? And I had a really good experience. The other panelists I was on the panel with were good, and there were people that I knew from my writing circles. So it was great. And then the second literary festival I went to as an author it wasn't bad.
Yeah. We're going to leave it nameless. Is that how
we're going to leave it?
Let's leave it nameless.
You know,
there's going to be a lot of nameless festivals in this episode, everybody.
Yes, we don't want to incriminate anyone. It wasn't bad. I was happy that I was invited. It was great to get the publicity, the exposure, to be able to like talk to other writers. Getting paid is nice, you know? But once I got there the day of it, I'll be honest, I felt a little weird because I was the only not white person on the panel. So it was like 3 authors and a moderator, and everyone else was white except for me. So I just got this like really strange feeling that maybe I was there because I wasn't white and they just needed like a token diverse person to make sure that it wasn't all, you know? And so like it felt a little weird, but also part of me was thinking, you know, if I got the opportunity because I'm a person of color, then I'll take it. Yeah. You know, like this is a good opportunity. And if I need to play the diversity card, it might feel uncomfortable, but I'm going to do it. Yeah. And that's kind of maybe an ugly truth around this whole diversity conversation sometimes is like, yes, sometimes we are playing the diversity card and sometimes we need to use that to our advantage. Yeah. And I think in addition to what made it uncomfortable was that the panel was centered around a romance trope. It was the second chance romance trope. And the book that I was promoting at the time did not have that trope.
Yeah, those are the things that'll make you feel really like I was invited to check off a box.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it was a little bit weird, especially when the question came up that was like, oh, tell us about how this trope is used in your book. And I was like, well, but otherwise it was good. It was, again, like good to have that opportunity, good to meet the readers that came up and talked to me afterward. So yeah, that's my experience. What are your experiences?
Well, it's interesting because I kind of have to put them in like before FOLD, after FOLD categories because my experiences before FOLD or in the early stages of working on FOLD are very different than some of my experiences afterwards. I've had the like great privilege of being at most, maybe all of the major literary festivals in Canada and a lot of the like lesser known ones as well. And so I've seen, you know, a lot of literary festivals, either as an attendee, but even as an author, I've been able to go to a lot. And that's a real privilege. Like, I think it's really important for people to understand, especially people who are listening who might be authors, who maybe have never been invited to a literary festival, that that's very common. When my first book came out stone thrower, I did not get invited to any literary festivals. I actually had to like pull a friend card and be like, I had a friend who organized a festival. I was like, how does this work? She was like, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize you had a book coming out. Like I would have invited you. And so she threw together this like last minute, like pre-festival event that I was kind of part of the festival, but kind of not. And so like, I think it's normal to come out with a book, to hope to go on tour and do literary festival events, and to find that that's not actually the case. The great thing about literary festivals is you get to see different cities, different parts of the country potentially. Oftentimes your travel is covered. Oftentimes you get paid to do your events. So it's a really kind of glitzy, glamorous experience when you're in the loop.
You feel really special.
You feel very special, I will say that. Somebody picks you up at the airport with like your name on a sign. Like it's like a dream. Like, okay.
Yeah.
I am Taylor Swift. I have made it. And so I think that's like a really, it's very glamorous, it's very privileged experience, and it's not something everybody gets to know.
Yeah.
I think pre-Fold, one of the reasons I started Fold was because I had some really negative experiences. I remember going to a literary festival, very like a big one, a good one.
Shall remain nameless.
Shall remain nameless.
Yeah.
And I went to do a dialogue workshop. This was me going as an attendee. And I went to do a dialogue workshop, and I was in the workshop. I was the only Black person in the room. And the person who was running the workshop was an author, a white woman, and she had selected an excerpt from a book to like talk about dialogue. And the excerpt was a conversation between a white man and a white woman about their Negro servant or slave or maid or I don't know.
Oh my God.
Indentured person that was being abused, essentially.
Oh my God.
And so it was just like there were these words like that, you know, people in the group were all like using and being asked to be a part of. And I was just like, this feels awkward. And also like of all the dialogue in all the world, this is the one you thought was the best and most essential.
That was the only one she could find.
Yeah. And I remember thinking, and this is a thing that's been a really big part of my work with Fold. I remember thinking I was not expected to be here.
Right.
Like there's no way you picked this excerpt and thought there'd be a Black person in the room. And so like if I'm not expected to be here, why? Who, you know, and what kind of like confidence in that, like how should I take that? You know, and I also, I remember going to the bookseller, same festival a little bit later, and I was like, you know, I have a book coming out. I was trying to be brave. I was trying to be that like, you know, put yourself out there. Like, you know, I talk to self-published authors all the time who are like, I just go into bookstores and I'm like, do you want my book? And people are like, yeah. So I'm like, I'm just going to do this thing. And I went to talk to the bookseller and I was like, you know, my dad was a professional football player. It's a story of his life. It's a story of race in Canada. And I would love to like come back sometime and like maybe do a reading in the store or whatever. And I said, I remember saying this, I remember maybe for Black History Month. And it's like that thing, right? Like I will use the thing that you use to market us to sell myself. Like I will put myself out there in the awkward quote unquote diversity way to try and get it in. And he was like, oh, yeah, well, we really don't do like Black History Month. Kind of like, I was like, what? Like you don't do it? Like you don't celebrate? Like what does that mean? Right? And I walked away. I've always been terrible in the moment addressing difficult situations. I don't know if
That's tough.
When stuff comes at me in the moment, I'm so overwhelmed by like, did I actually experience that? Did they mean what they said? Like, what is happening here? And I'm never very good at responding right away. And so I ended up writing a letter to him and sending it. And he did respond back and apologize. But those were the moments that kind of made me build Fold.
Wow.
And like build it a little bit differently. And it's interesting that the conversation about the panel that you talked about, this is my last story, I promise. But I did a panel in the early stages of planning Fold where I was that panel where everybody else at the festival was kind of like white, not kind of white, they were white. And they had this one panel where three of us were BIPOC, were people of color.
Yeah.
And we were all on the panel together and it was called something like writing home, right? This idea of, yeah. Interesting thing for me is that writing home, like Canada is my home. Like I didn't have another country. Both of the other authors had books where they were writing about other countries and like that experience. Whatever, it's fine. So I was on this panel and this white woman stood up and said, you know, you're talking about writing home, but I don't feel very represented here as like a European woman, right? And my fellow panelists were like stuck. The hilarious thing was, remember I just said I'm terrible at responding in the moment?
Yeah.
That exact moment question had come up in a conference earlier. Like I had been at like, I don't know, 4 or 5 months before then, where I had heard a group of panelists, a woman say almost the exact same thing in conversation. And I was like, what would I have said? And I had spent months thinking about how I would have responded. And so when she said that, I was ready. Like the other panelists looked at me like, do you want to take this one? I was like, yes, I will take this one. And I remember saying to her, like, I know you don't feel represented and I know that's a horrible feeling. And I know that that's a horrible feeling because I feel it so often when I go into places.
Yeah.
And you have to recognize that in the 20 plus other panels and events at this festival, you can find yourself represented in one way or another. But for many of the people of color in this room, this is the only panel where they feel represented. And
did she?
It was like a mic drop pop moment.
Did she respond to that?
No, she sat down.
Okay.
She was awfully quiet after that.
As she should be.
As she should be. But like that's the kind of thing I think there's this really difficult, I think difficult experiences as an author are part of the reason why I created FOLD. But now that I do FOLD, I feel like there's also difficult experiences that I can in many ways empathize with my fellow like festival curators about how to do it better, how to make it work.
Yeah.
So I think that's really what I'm interested in talking about too.
Yeah, I think so. I think that when we're standing from the outside, and this applies in every situation, standing on the outside, it's easy to say, oh, they should have done this better, they should have done that, or like, why didn't they consider this? Or like, this seems like such an obvious thing that they missed. But when you're inside an organization and you realize there are so many things to consider, so many like pressures coming at us in all different directions that we sometimes have to make less than ideal decisions.
Yeah.
And we end up in a place where we would not have wanted to be, but that is better than where we could have been.
Yeah.
Right. And so having that, like working in that gray zone sometimes is hard for people from the outside to see and accept and to have like understanding around.
Yeah, we have this, one of our like biggest questions, or the thing that, if I was to say like the thesis of FOLD has always been the question of who's missing.
Yeah.
And it's always where we started in the early years, asking the question of who's missing at the literary festivals that we're going to. Seems like an easy question at the beginning.
Right.
And then it kind of evolved and we realized like who's missing from particular genres. Who's missing in the publishing departments, in the like staffing of publishing, not just who's missing on the shelves. You know, who's missing in certain types of conversations, whether it's about disability or queerness or faith. Like, who are we not hearing enough from, even as we talk about things that are, by their very nature, marginalized communities? And so that's been a really exciting way, I think, to evolve the festival over the years, is to ask that question. I think it's also tricky when you realize in any given festival year, you cannot have everyone.
Yeah.
You are not going to have every community or culture represented. And so the who's missing question is also where we often begin at each festival season and saying, who's missing? Who didn't we see last year at all? Who haven't we seen on the roster in, multiple years? And asking like, how might we do that thoughtfully? And sometimes that's easy. Sometimes that's been like, who's missing? We've been missing this particular group and we have a whole panel about it. And it's like, boom, great. We've like filled a little bit of a hole. But sometimes it's not that easy. I remember one of the conversations around disability was something we wanted to have a panel on really early on. Mental health was another one. And it wasn't just that we could the next year have that panel. The books weren't there to have the authors that we would need. And also the books that were there didn't have the kind of range within those authors to make the conversation what it needed to be. And so it took a few years to build some of those panels.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited about our guest today. I think we're almost ready to bring our guest in because I think she's going to have a really great way of kind of getting into some of these details, not only as an author herself, but because of her background, even with FOLD. So excited about that.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. So today's guest, very exciting, is someone you might be quite familiar with if you've been a part of the FOLD at all. Welcome, Amanda Leduc.
Thanks, guys. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'll do a little bit of an intro of you just so everybody who is new to knowing you knows all the good things. So Amanda joined the Fold on staff in 2016, which was the year of the very first festival. So we're planning our 10th. She was there at the very beginning. She's been involved in playing the Fold since then, up until recently when she decided to depart to do her writing. And I'll share a little bit about her writing. She's an accomplished author of many books, including, but not limited to, The Centaur's Wife, Disfigured, and she has a forthcoming novel in the new year called Wild Life.
That's correct. Yes.
So exciting to have you here.
Yeah.
Exciting to be here. Thank you for having me.
So before you joined us, we were talking about our Jael and I's experience with literary festivals. Would you like to share a little bit about your experience as an author going to literary festivals?
Yes. So because of the way that my novels or my books sort of came out into the world, my literary festival experience, I feel, is in some ways it feels a little bit limited, because the festival that I went to when my first novel came out was TIFA, which was at the time known as IFOA. And I did Gritlit as well, Gritlit, the Festival of Hamilton. And then when my second book came out, it was 2020. So everything had switched to being virtual. And then when my novel, The Centaur's Wife, came out in 2021, everything was virtual then as well. So I actually am really looking forward to next year, hopefully making the festival circuit in the ways that I know lots of us have done over the years. And it was, I've always felt very lucky in the sense that I've had a great experience at the festivals that I have gone to, whether it was virtual or, the times that I was able to do it in person. And what I think was also interesting for me was that I wasn't, even though I, as many people know, I have a disability, I have cerebral palsy, but I wasn't identifying as a disabled writer as such when my first book came out. So I wasn't going to physical festivals and physical spaces and thinking about the experience of being at a festival from a disabled person's perspective. And that was something that really changed for me, obviously, when Disfigured came out, but then also, 3 weeks after Disfigured was published, the world shut down because of the COVID pandemic. And Jael, you and I remember that time making that switch. I mean, we went from, holding an in-person festival to holding a virtual festival in 6 weeks. And there was a lot of work that happened both in that 6 weeks and then in the ensuing months to thinking about what it means to attend a festival and have it be an accessible festival, right? From the perspective of an author, but also from the perspective of an organizer as well. And then now that we are moving toward this world where in many cases, people are doing in-person things again. And then also there are some virtual programming that elements that are still going on. What does it mean to create accessibility across all of those spaces? It's been a question that, I didn't come into this thinking about these kinds of things. And now we're definitely living in a world where it's top of mind all the time.
It's funny because I think I knew when we moved the festival to virtual, it was much easier to accommodate anybody and everybody, no matter where they were in the world, no matter what their circumstances. I remember having an author who was like, my due date is around the time of the festival, but like basically, unless it's the day of the festival, I should be fine, and there's those kind of things that in person, you would never, right? So in some ways, the virtual festivals in 2020 and 2021 were the most accessible festivals in a lot of ways. Everybody was participating from the same place in very similar ways. Now, obviously, the deaf, hard of hearing, those communities still, there's challenges, I think, in making things more accessible. But in terms of like who could say yes to being there, they were the most accessible. And I also think there were the most variety of invitations that year, to be honest. I think a lot of people, while we talk about how hard it was in those years and we didn't get to go places and we were in our pajamas, I did way more events that year. I know a lot of new authors that went to festivals that, if I'm being honest, probably wouldn't or maybe wouldn't have been invited to if it had only been in person.
Yes, that's
So there was
true.
like we don't talk about it a lot, but that's the truth of those years as well. And now that we're back to in person, I see some of those, like the same people at all the festivals, the same publishers being allowed to travel, and like, it's probably worthwhile to talk about like how this actually comes about, because when you're planning a literary festival, typically you get pitched a bunch of books. And it can work in one of two ways. You can sit down to in person. It used to all be in person. You'd sit down with a publicist and they would tell you all the authors that they have that have books coming out close to the time of the festival. And they'll say, you know, we will pay for travel or we won't pay for travel for that person. And there'll be kind of that discussion. So you can get pitched in person. You can get pitched via email. So they'll just send you an email of a bunch of authors that they have. And you can also sort of like do the reverse where you pitch them in terms of like you find their catalog and you reach out and say, hey, I want to have that author. So it can kind of come a couple different ways. And that kind of creates challenges of its own.
Oh, does it ever?
So can you guys talk a bit about like what are the pros and cons of doing it either way if they're coming to you or you're going to them?
I mean, I think certainly from my perspective, there were easier things about both instances, right? When the publicist comes to you, it's easier in a sense because you can sort of sit back and listen to the pitches and think, you know, this is a curated list. They know the different authors that they have. So, you know, they're thinking about the authors that they have and how they would fit the festival and all that sort of thing. But as we also know, you know, publicity, when it comes to book publishing, I mean, publicists have a very sort of defined framework of time in many cases, right, for the authors that they have. And so they're not necessarily thinking, like if they have an author whose books are coming out in, you know, the summer or the fall of 2025, they're not thinking about pitching them to the Fold because the Fold happens beforehand. But they're also not thinking about authors that they maybe had who, you know, came out in the summer of 2024. And so their books will have been out for some time before the festival. And so sometimes you miss that very specific window when publicists come to you and they have particular authors in mind. You miss other people that they may be representing because they just don't think to pitch them to you. So that is, you know, I think a drawback sometimes where it's great to have publicists come to you with these names, but then you're not getting everybody that you would hope to get. And that's where going and doing it yourself can be helpful. But that's also really time consuming because then we're going through all the catalogs and, you know, listening to all of this information and also relying on word of mouth in lots of instances, paying attention to social media, all of which is really, really great. And I think when you're in the midst of planning the festival, you are kind of doing that anyway. You're sort of open to and trying to pay attention to a million things at once. But it does take a toll. And, you know, it can be really, really hard when you get to a point where you've curated a festival and you have your lineup and then you hear about an author whose work is coming out around the same time and you just didn't happen to hear about them. And it just, it's hard. It is really hard work.
I think that in person, and here's the thing, since the pandemic, there's also been virtual pitches, which I consider in the same front as in person. I do not particularly care if I go into your office or if we meet virtually. Does not matter to me. Obviously, way easier to do more pitches when you're doing them virtually. A lot of flexibility when you do it virtual to take notes and do things in a way that feels kind of awkward when you're sitting next to a group of people. I think the thing that's tricky for Fold, that's very important for Fold as well, is like, most pitches are designed to be like, hey, this is this person. They're on this like New York bestsellers list and their book is about, you know, Patty and Sandy meeting on the beach and then going and doing this and this and this and then they fall in love and then this happens and like, isn't that great? And I'm like, I don't care. Like, I don't care what happens to Patty and Sandy at the beach. I care about the author. What's their name? Where are they from? What are they passionate about? What do they do in their spare time? You know, we've always wanted to have panels where it's like a bunch of writers who also are like compulsive knitters or, you know what I mean? Like, I want to know like the real things about these people and not just what's in their bio. I mean, honestly, what's in their bio is the least interesting part of like curating, right? If I can see it in their bio, everybody knows it. But we're trying to find out the deeper stuff. I'm also looking, I'm not so driven by this, like the festival is in May and their book came out in March or their book came out in April. That's actually kind of the worst for us because you're expecting people in the regular world that are going to buy tickets to kind of know that, like to know that this is a new book and they should be excited about it. Most of the people I know in Brampton and in suburbs and even in major cities are like reading the book they were supposed to read a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. So it's really tricky to find that magic recipe. And we've been working at it for 10 years, literally. We send a pitch to publicists and we'll say, we're looking for this kind of author or this kind of pitch. We've specifically said, like, don't tell me the plot. I mean, I hate spoilers. So I even hate when people tell me the plot from a purely logistic level. As soon as you tell me the plot, I'm actually less inclined to read it. So I'm like, I don't want to know. Tell me the title, tell me the genre, tell me about the person. And if the person is, for example, it's a queer Muslim writer and there's a queer Muslim character who is wrestling with like their faith and their relationship with their community, great. That's all I need to know, right? Like that's it, right? I don't need to know what happens to them and what goes on. So I think that that's also been kind of a challenge in creating Fold, is that we're trying to do things differently, and the industry is just like so used to doing things a certain way. And I will say 10 years in, there's a bunch of publishers and publicists that have really got it and are like, have been to Fold and like get what we do and how we do it. Another thing that's kind of different for us is we curate we build the festival event by event. So rather than inviting 20 authors and then figuring out how we put them in conversation or how we use them, we actually say, okay, we're going to do an event this evening that's like a sort of community-based event. It's going to be in this kind of space and have this many seats. Like, what kind of book and author would be ideal for that conversation? Sometimes when those events work really well, we do them every year from then on because we just get so excited about it. But then we know, okay, we have the Great Reception every Friday. 6 authors are going to read on stage with a band behind them. You know, we know what to look for now with those 6 authors. So we're curating in a particular way in that regard. We're looking at things in a particular way. And it's hard because we don't always, publicists or publishers who don't know that, don't understand that, are sort of like, this author came out with a great book and they won this award last year. Of course you're going to want them. And I'm like, but we don't do one-on-one interviews. And I know that author only does one-on-one interviews. So maybe no.
I think it's interesting because we've just gone through several weeks of pitches with publicists at publishers. And there were a few times when we asked the publicist, do you know, like a question about the author, do you know how the author identifies in this respect or that respect? Or and the publicist couldn't answer. They didn't know. And I think, I mean, there's a lot of, I guess, issues around that, but sometimes like they just have too many authors they're representing and it's hard for them to know all the things about all the authors. Sometimes it might be an author that's not quite front of mind, that maybe they worked on them a few months ago and now they can't remember that information. But I think it's just tricky to say, like, we're looking for these types of people and how do we find those people? It's hard for us to know just based off of catalogs and bios. And so we're relying on the publicists. But at the end of the day, we can't always rely on the publicists because they're not always reliable. Like, no fault to them. Sometimes it's just too much for them to hold all in their brain.
Well, I will say, and Amanda, you probably remember the early years, it was like that. Like it was bad. In the early years, we would go into pitches and they would just tell us about a bunch of authors and we would say, like, how are they marginalized? Like, what is going on? And they usually like either didn't know, weren't sure, weren't comfortable. There have been publishers in the last 10 years who have literally built new forms to ask their authors questions. I don't want to say it's all Fold, but I do think Fold's played a part in that so that they know more about their authors coming in. There's one publisher who, like, they not only know their authors, like, deeply, like, this is how this person identifies, this is the kind of work that they're writing, this is the kind of work they do. They will also tell us what kind of panels and events and people they'd like to be on panels with. And it doesn't always work out, but I can tell you some of our big popular events have come from authors whose publicists are so effective that they've said, like, this is an event that they've thought of and really think is a great idea. And they were right. It was a great idea. I don't know if you remember those.
I remember. I do. Yeah. That was fun times.
But I think this question about, like, this idea, I'm always thinking about this from the perspective, having done this, of whether how much of the work we're doing is curating and how much of it's gatekeeping. And gatekeeping, I think, is being kind of like a negative, and curating maybe being as a more positive. And, like, I don't know what you guys think about that in terms of the role of, like, programming coordinator and festival directors.
I mean, I think for me, you know, that it's central to that idea of having a gate in the first place, right? If you have a gate, you are by definition keeping something out. And I think when you're trying to curate conversations, what you're trying to do is actually create a space where any kind of conversation can happen. And what's important in creating a space like that is, a certain level of respect and decency and warmth and community, so that people really feel like they're in a safe space, yes, but they're also in a space where other people take responsibility for them, and they can take responsibility for other people in terms of creating a space, right? Where you come into the fold and you feel like you're part of a community. You feel like you're having conversations that, aren't just going to stop at the festival. They are conversations that can continue out in the wider world. And with gatekeeping, I think, we sometimes, there's this feeling that only certain people are allowed to say certain things, or only certain people can say certain things. This idea that authors are somehow special experts who can say certain things, and they, get that status just by coming into a space, just by publishing a book. It's difficult. Like, I think the whole system needs to be dismantled in that way, right? We are inviting people into a wider conversation. So when you are inviting people in to participate in that conversation, how do you want them to bring parts of themselves to that discussion, right? Where the whole gatekeeping idea, there's really this sort of inherent to that is, you can say certain things better than other people can say certain things. And Fold has never been about that. There's just something, I guess, very elitist to me, I think, in terms of gatekeeping, just in general.
But I feel like that sometimes. Like, I guess I feel the pressure of curating and gatekeeping at the same time. Like, on one hand, I'm like, oh, I want to make this conversation. I remember when we wanted to have a conversation about disability, and we were like, we can't have a panel of all white disabled folks. And we really had to kind of wait, search, ask, and build a panel that had more range on it, so that the conversation could get to all the pieces that we thought were kind of missing in that space. And that's like a good example of curating for me, where I'm like, yeah, we can do that. But I also feel it when I know there's a great author who has a book out. Sometimes they're like a personal friend, and that's where I feel it the hardest. And I just can't find the right panel, the right event for their particular book, their particular style, their particular approach. And that's where I feel the gatekeeping side of it. I feel like, oh, I should just who cares? Just invite them. They're great. We'll figure it out. But I know it's not that easy, And that's where I struggle, I think.
Yeah, I struggle with that too. And I think it goes back again for me to that idea of the gate in the first place, right? If you take it for granted that these conversations are only happening in these particular ways, then yes, it does become difficult, because you think, oh, we're going to have this conversation about disability, and it needs to do a lot of heavy lifting. We need to make sure that we have really great representation here, because this is the only place that this conversation is ever going to happen. And when you try to start thinking wider in that sense, where this is one place where this conversation about disability is going to happen, but we are also, in the work that we are doing here, trying to encourage these conversations to happen in other places, right? And trying to lead by example, and hoping that other festivals and other gatherings can, emulate conversation in that same kind of way, approach things with that same spirit of inclusiveness, where it's like, this is not just a one and done deal. Like, these conversations need to be happening in literary festivals because it's a particular place that has a particular kind of spotlight, which is great. But how do we then carry this work forward in the rest of our lives, right? How do we encourage other spaces to have conversations like this? And particularly to think about marginalized populations and who, hasn't had opportunities to participate in conversations in this way before.
I think it goes back to that idea of like, when we're looking from the outside, it's easy to say, oh, well, you didn't have this person or that person, and why are you leaving out people from this community or people with that identity? And then when we're on the inside and we are actually trying to put together a panel of like 3 authors and a moderator, it's like we only have 3 spots and a moderator. And so there's only so many people we can actually bring and put into those chairs, right? And so I like the idea that this is not the only place we're having this conversation. And so like, yes, maybe in this moment and on this stage, we can only fit 4 chairs, but the conversation extends past that. And I think it's creating that bridge. How do we make sure that the conversation does extend past that 1 hour we have on the stage?
Like, that's the thing, right? It should not be the only place where this conversation is happening. But honestly, in the early years, a lot of times it was the only place it was happening.
It was.
And certain conversations, like, it just, the only place it was going to happen was at FOLD. And I'm not saying that to knock any other festivals, because y'all know I go to lots of them. I love them. I will shout them out all the time. But there's certain things that, like, I think we were well suited to be able to do, and where, like, it just wasn't going to happen in other places that way. Especially now that we're more virtual, there's certain conversations that are not, especially when we're focused on Canadians, not alone marginalized communities, but specifically Canadians. Like, that's a particular kind of dynamic that isn't happening in the same way quite anywhere else. So think about that. I'm curious for you, Lin, having gone through all the pitches now, having seen it, how you're feeling about curating the lineup for the 10th anniversary.
It's challenging. It's challenging. And I'm going to say, this is probably going to sound bad, but there is a lot of power when you're sitting in this position of being able to say, I get to choose who to invite and who not to invite. And because I think for me, the gatekeeping and the curating almost feels like 2 sides of the same coin. Because when I say I'm going to invite this person, then I'm also saying I'm not going to invite that person. And I need to have a reason for that. And so then it becomes a very, very much like an internal question of like, what are my ethics and what are my values? And can I justify this decision and feel comfortable with my justification of like, yes, I'm going to invite this person, but that person I deemed not good enough for whatever reason, in air quotes, to be on this panel. And so it's tricky. And it is like the whole, like, with great power comes great responsibility. But it does kind of feel like that, to say like, yeah, it's easy for me to criticize other literary festivals. It's like, oh, you guys didn't do this, and why didn't you do that? And why didn't you invite this person? Why didn't you invite me?
Yeah.
And
we've been called out like that too. People have, like, on social media been like, I wasn't invited. People have come up to me in person and be like, I was a little disappointed I wasn't invited. Yeah. Honestly, heartbreaking. Worst feeling ever, all the time.
Because, like, I think especially because we are the Festival of Literary Diversity, and it is something that really matters to us, we want to make sure that everyone who wants to be included is included. Yeah. And to realize that we missed out on something either because we just it wasn't on our radar, or it wasn't pitched to us, or for whatever reason that we missed something that would have been amazing to have. That is heartbreaking.
Can I just say, though, I think that's also symptomatic of a larger issue where you have people who are crushed that they were not invited to the FOLD or were not able to come to the FOLD. And part of the reason for feeling crushed is because they're also not getting invited to other places. And that's not, solely the responsibility of the FOLD to hold that up. Like, this is a call to action for other festivals and other programming ventures to really think deeply about the kind of programming that you hold and what voices have you perhaps not had on your stages before. This is a responsibility that we all need to be upholding.
I think there's usually, like, one of 2 reasons why someone hasn't been invited, right? Either they weren't pitched and we didn't know about it, or they were pitched and it just didn't fit with the lineup that ended up being what happened, right? Whether it's, I remember one year we did a panel on horror. And so we did this whole panel, really great lineup. The next year, we didn't do a panel on horror because we had done one the previous year, and the who's missing question, there were other things that had been missing the year before that we tried to curate. So it can be like that simple. And sometimes it's just, this person, the publisher was flying them in and was able to make it happen in a way that we would have to pay out of pocket. So there's sometimes money-making decisions that go into it too. And it's heartbreaking to deal with that. And that's the point where the, like, gatekeeping really feels most pressing, I think. I think also from the perspective, I want to talk to you a little bit about this, Amanda, about sort of the challenge for writers as well in this perspective, because you kind of approach getting pitched a little bit differently now than you did when you first started writing. And I think it's really important, and I want people to know a little bit about it and hear a little bit about, you have what's called a rider. I don't know if anybody else knows what that is. And it sounds super bougie. I'm going to let you explain, but I think it's important because it also comes into the curation gatekeeping experience.
So I call it an access and inclusion rider. And it's a new thing for me in terms of it being an official document. Unofficially, for the last couple of years, I've made it a practice to, for example, make sure that any physical events that I do need to be in wheelchair accessible spaces, which means wheelchair accessible entry and access on the premises to a wheelchair accessible washroom. Other things like making sure that virtual events have captioning, making sure that live events, in-person events have captioning as well. Like these have all sort of been cobbled together for me over the last couple of years because that question of access, like we were talking about just a little while ago with the virtual sessions, right? The virtual festivals were so much more accessible in many ways. And it really opened up that question for me of how do we carry these practices forward into this new literary landscape that we're building, right? And so unofficially, I had cobbled all that stuff together. And then this year I was like, okay, I'm getting ready for my new book coming out in the spring. So how do I, even before I get invited to places, how do I make sure that these kinds of things are top of mind for publishers and publicists, not just so they can potentially have me as a guest, but I want them to be thinking about these things for other guests as well, to really make it kind of top of mind right from the very beginning. If you're going to have an author, you need to be thinking about what does that author need in terms of an access need? What do they need in terms of other kinds of things, right? And from there, how do you then begin to build your panels in a more inclusive way, right? So obviously, physical access is really important to me. Other non-negotiables include having captioning at events, making sure that you can have ASL if that is available is also really, really great. And then other things like, economic access to panels and stuff like that. Like, what does it mean when you have panels and you're inviting authors to come and speak? Do you have options available for attendees who are low income or don't have the funds to otherwise attend? Or, is that not an option that you offer? If it isn't an option that you offer, maybe we should start thinking about these kinds of things. When you build your panels, are you making sure that you're not going to put me on a panel full of white folks where there isn't some other kind of, diversity in terms of disability, in terms of mental illness, in terms of class, differentiation. Like if none of that is being discussed on a panel, like why I don't want to be, on a panel full of all white folks. And so these are the kinds of things that, don't necessarily always come top of mind when people are doing programming. So I think it's really an opportunity for me as someone who, as with all of us, I have a certain degree of privilege and also a certain degree of challenge. But how do I then use that privilege in a way that can open up these conversations and really hopefully get people thinking about it in a wider sense, not just for me, but then also for all of the other authors that you invite to your festivals.
Can I ask, when you've presented that writer to whomever is inviting you, what kind of responses have you gotten?
Well, it hasn't actually been presented to anybody who has. I haven't gotten any invites
you're getting
yet.
You're getting the heads up.
You're getting the heads up. I might not get any invites now as a result of all of this. I'm hopeful that, and I did make sure that when I was drafting the rider, I really wanted to be an entryway into a conversation. So if someone is interested in having me at their festival and at their space and they encounter some issues or they can foresee that there might be issues and they come to me and say that, I'm like, okay, great. Let's think about how we can work through these issues and perhaps institute some different ways of doing things, which would mean that if you are then faced with this again in the future or situations similar to this in the future, you have some kind of blueprint for dealing with it. This is hopefully how, I can do a small thing to create other waves of change.
Yeah. Stages are a big thing, I will say.
They are
like
a huge thing.
the biggest thing that I've seen. One of the hardest things for us to deal with in the early years, if I'm being honest. You know, you had to choose. I remember one year we got like a very low stage for the PAMA, for the museum. And we had to rethink that. So the next year we had no stage. Well, then there were like visibility and sightline issues that were presenting other challenges. And so it was always what we learned in those early stages is it's like, it's never easy, right? It's never easy. But one of the things with the who's missing is like, how do you take what you learn and just improve on it? I've really realized that this work is never going to be done. So every year I'm just trying to like do it a little bit better. I'm just trying to figure out a little bit more. We've been very lucky now to be at the Rose in downtown Brampton for the last 6 years, I guess. And just the accessibility in that building is perfect. So it's really easy to work with on every level. And I'm very lucky because it can be difficult and it's important. So it's the kind of difficult that you want to figure out, but it usually has some sort of like complication financially or otherwise. So I think that's a thing that we're thinking about. Yeah. Anything else? I have an idea. I know. Anyways, I'm going to save it a little bit. I think I'm going to save it. Maybe not.
Okay.
Do you want to do our secret game?
Yes. Okay.
It's a little bit of twist on the game. So you set it up a little bit.
Okay. So
way to put Lynn on the spot.
Yeah, I'm going to put Lynn on the spot, then I'm going to put you on the spot.
Oh, fantastic.
This is how this is going to go.
Okay. All right. So the game is called Top Shelf. Top Shelf meaning what are the top 3 books that you feel have made a big impact over the past decade, or just 3 books that you would like to recommend?
Okay, so my twist is, I know you probably have books prepared, but I thought it would be kind of fun to change things up a little bit.
Great.
And maybe do, Amanda's like, I hate you all the time. But I'm thinking top 3 like events that you curated during your time at FOLD.
Oh, that's a good question.
And I should have thought
Still
about this
putting
earlier.
me on the spot, though.
So that you could have thought about it. So now I'm going to have this awkward conversation with Lynn about something so that you know. Can you think of, okay, it doesn't have to be top. I think when you say top, automatically you start to feel stressed out about like the top. But like the 3 that come to mind most quickly. You're welcome to share your books as well. But I think because you've had this very special role over the last 10 years, it would be great to hear, especially for Lynn as she begins her curation.
Yeah, for sure.
The 3 that kind of stick up for you.
I mean, the first one that probably comes to mind is the interview that you and I did with Dorothy Ellen Palmer at the first festival, at the first FOLD. That was really wonderful. It was also, I think, certainly my first time moderating a discussion at the FOLD. And it was probably one of the first times that I really guided a conversation in that way. So it holds a special part in my heart for that reason. I think it was in 2019, we did the Indigenous Showcase and we had the hoop dancer. I really, really loved that event. See, when the question about the 3 books, it was so funny because it took me days and I was like, it's like I've never read a book before in my entire life. And now I'm thinking back and I'm like, festival, did I participate in a festival? Have I helped to organize a festival at all?
And this is the thing that's wild is that Amanda's role before was not quite the same as the role that Lynn holds now. And so like Amanda did everything. Like, and I don't mean, she would never say she like did everything, but I mean, she had her hand in
She's not exaggerating.
many
I did
different,
do everything.
there were so many different departments that she was like, oh, I'll do that. I've done that for years, whatever. And so like her knowledge of like all the publicists, the author's name, even saying like, I think this was in 2019. I'm like, girl, I cannot remember any year. It was virtual or it was in person. That is basically all I can remember. Sometimes I can remember based on knowing what the venue was because we changed venues so much in those early years. I can sort of be like, oh, that one was in the church and that one was in City Hall. And so I know it was 2016 versus 2017 or whatever. But do you have a third yet?
No, they've all gone.
Okay, so I'm going to give you one. This is my favorite, probably the panel that sticks out to me the most still to this day, that I like go back to the book, I go back to the conversation, and it was, I think the book was called Big.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah.
Yep. That was one that stuck out.
And it was a panel about bodies. And the anthology was a collection of women, different sizes, who were talking about their relationship to fatness. And it blew my mind. It changed my life. It affects everything I do and think about to this day. That's mine.
Okay.
At the top. I don't know what the other two would be.
See, I have a candidate for the third one.
Okay.
And these are, to be clear, these are just three that, came to mind. They're not ranked in any way, but the third would have been Rage Becomes Her.
Oh,
the
that was
session
a good
that we
one.
did, at 2019.
Soraya Shamli.
Soraya Shamli, Imani Barbarin came to the
That was
festival.
it.
That
Oh,
was
yeah.
so wonderful. Alicia Elliott. And then was it Luna Ferguson who was on that panel as well? That one was wonderful.
Yeah.
And it was so funny, and just I think the reason that I mean, it just such a great group of speakers, but it really embodied that sense of collective community for me, because you had all of these speakers who were coming from very different circumstances and backgrounds, and yet they all it just felt like, this conversation was such a vibrant thing. Everybody really cared about each other in that space, and we were really just in awe of the respect and the love that everybody was showing each other on that stage.
That was our first year
I
at
thought
the
it was really
Rose
great.
too, so it felt really quite spectacular for the first time. We had these nice chairs on this beautiful big stage, and the book was called Rage Becomes Her, so it was about women and rage and how that gets manifested or sort of shut down. So that's a good one. That's a good one. I like it. Top shelf. Top shelf. You did it. Did you want to share your books too? Since
Sure, I will share my
since
books.
you had to think about them for a week.
I know. So the first book, I would say, A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. I just think is such a beautiful melding of the personal and also the political. And it just really made me think anew about the Indigenous peoples here and their stories and the way that so much of that has shaped who we all are and who we are as a festival, really. The second one would be Pacifique by Sarah L. Taggart, which is a book about, it's a novel. It's about psychosis. And full disclosure, I acquired this book for Coach House and did edits on the book as well. And it really made me think differently about what it means to see the world in different ways. And I would really encourage people to seek it out and read it. And the third one is actually not a Canadian book. It's an American book.
Just kidding.
It's Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado, which I sometimes like to think of as Rage, the short story collection. I think it's a beautiful book, and it does so much around rage, yes, and also queerness, and also this interrogation of the stories that we have told ourselves in society for so long. And it's really, wrapped up in fairy tales and fables, which is totally my jam. So yes, I would recommend those three for sure.
Well, thank you. Thank you for participating in Top Shelf Part 1 and Part 2. Thank you for your flexibility. That is a wrap, I think, for episode 2. Our next episode will be released next month or so, sometime around there. Just make sure to follow us on social media at The Fold, the Festival of Literary Diversity. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, Facebook. And you can find updates on the podcast and other things there. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you can find out when the next episode drops. You could also watch the video version on The Fold's YouTube channel.
And if you enjoyed this podcast and you want to support the podcast or the work that we do at The Fold, you can support us in a number of ways. You can rate and review the podcast on your podcast player of choice. You can tell all of your friends about us, and you can even donate to us at thefoldcanada.org/donate.
I want to thank Amanda for coming. I also want to encourage you to join us at the Festival of Literary Diversity. It's a multimodal festival that will run April 27th to May 4th. You can join us from anywhere in the world, April 27th to April 30th of 2025 at our virtual events, and in Brampton, May 1st to the 4th. Thank you to Sheridan's Creative Writing and Publishing Program for sponsoring this episode. We will see you next time on Into the Fold with Jael and Lin.
Bye.